For hundreds of thousands of years, humans survived by moving. They followed herds, seasons, storms, rivers, fruiting trees, migrating birds, and the invisible rhythm of a wild planet. Home was not a place. Home was a path. A bend in the river remembered from childhood. A valley where deer returned every spring. A cave used for one winter, then abandoned when the cold passed. To be human was to walk. Then, in a few places on Earth, something changed. People began to stop. They built huts that were meant to last more than one season. They buried their dead near the living. They stored grain in pits and baskets. They returned to the same patch of land again and again until the land became more than useful. It became theirs. And from that decision, everything followed. Villages, temples, kings, taxes, writing, laws, armies, money, and the first empires. But why did humans stop being nomads? Why would people who had survived for so long by moving choose to stay in one place, surrounded by work, hunger, disease, and danger? The answer is not simple. Humans did not wake up one morning and invent civilization. They were pushed, tempted, trapped, and transformed by a chain of changes so slow that no one living through them could have seen the ending. For most of human history, hunting and gathering was not a primitive failure. It was a brilliant strategy. Small groups moved through rich landscapes, taking what nature offered and leaving before any one place was exhausted. They knew plants with the precision of scientists, tracked animals with the patience of ghosts, and carried their world in memory rather than in walls. A good hunter-gatherer life could be flexible, social, and deeply skilled. The problem was not that nomads did not know how to settle. The problem was that, for a long time, settling made little sense. To stay in one place, a group needs reliable food nearby, not just for today, not just for summer, but through dry months, cold months, failed hunts, and growing children. A campsite becomes a village only when the surrounding land can feed people again and again. During the Ice Age, the world often made that difficult. Climate shifted sharply, glaciers expanded and retreated, rainfall patterns moved, animal herds changed routes, plants grew in different places from one generation to the next. In such a world, mobility was safety. If the food moved, humans moved. If the water dried, humans moved. If a region became dangerous, empty, or unlucky, humans moved. The wandering life was not aimless, it was insurance. Then the Ice Age ended. Around 12,000 years ago, the climate entered a warmer, more stable period. Across parts of the Near East, China, New Guinea, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Africa, and other regions, certain landscapes became more predictable. Wild grasses grew thick in open zones. Rivers flooded and withdrew in cycles. Fish, reeds, nuts, berries, and animals could be found in reliable patterns. In some places, humans discovered something powerful. You did not always need to chase food across huge distances. Sometimes food gathered itself around you. This was especially true in the Fertile Crescent, where wild wheat and barley grew naturally in dense stands. Long before people were farmers in the full sense, they harvested these wild grains with stone blades. They cut stalks, carried bundles back to camp, dried them, pounded them, roasted them, ground them into meal, and stored them. Grain had a strange power. Meat spoiled, fruit rotted, but dry grain could wait. It could sit in a basket, a clay-lined pit, or a storage room and still be eaten months later. For a moving people, storage is a problem. You cannot carry a village worth of grain on your back. But for people staying near good harvest grounds, storage became a revolution. The first step away from nomadism may not have been farming. It may have been storage. Once people began storing food, staying became more attractive. Once they stayed longer, they built better shelters. Once they built better shelters, they stored more food. Once they stored more food, they had something to protect. And once they had something to protect, they had a reason not to leave. This is where the human story begins to turn. A hunter-gatherer band can walk away from conflict. A settled village cannot easily move its houses, its buried ancestors, its grain stores, its tools, its fields, or its memories. The land begins to hold people down. A place that once served the group becomes part of the group's identity. The village is no longer just where people sleep. It is where children are born, where elders die, where rituals happen, where food is hidden, where debts are remembered, and where the dead remain beneath the earth. But settlement did not happen everywhere at once. Many groups remained nomadic or semi-nomadic for thousands of years, and many did so successfully. The move towards settled life depended on local conditions. In some places, abundant wild food allowed people to live in permanent or semi-permanent villages before full agriculture. In others, people moved seasonally, returning to favored sites. The boundary between nomad and farmer was not a wall. It was a long, blurred edge. Some hunted and planted. Some gathered and herded. Some stayed part of the year and moved the rest. Civilization did not begin with a clean break. It began with experiments. One of the biggest forces behind those experiments was population. When food becomes more reliable, more children survive. When more children survive, the group grows. When the group grows, the old wandering routes may not be enough. A small band can live lightly across a landscape. A larger group needs more food, more water, more fuel, more shelter, and more predictable resources. Growth creates pressure. More mouths mean people must harvest more intensely. They return to the same grain patches. They protect useful plants. They clear competing weeds. They scatter seeds near camp. At first, these actions may not look like farming. They look like careful gathering. But over generations, human hands begin shaping the plants. The plants change too. Wild wheat and barley naturally drop their seeds when ripe, scattering them for the next generation. But humans preferred stalks that held onto their seeds long enough to be harvested. Without knowing genetics, people selected plants that were easier to gather. Seeds became larger. Harvests became more dependable. The line between wild grass and crop slowly disappeared. Humans domesticated plants, but plants also domesticated humans. Every harvest demanded another season of work. Every field tied people to a schedule. The grain had to be planted. The weeds had to be pulled. The crop had to be watched. The harvest had to be cut at the right time. The stores had to be guarded. A nomad follows the world's calendar. A farmer is captured by it. Animals added another chain. Dogs had already joined humans much earlier, but goats, sheep, cattle, and pigs changed settled life in new ways. Herds could turn grass and scrub into meat, milk, hides, wool, bone, dung, and power. But animals also demanded care. They needed water, grazing, protection, breeding, and control. A herd is mobile wealth, but it is still wealth. It can be stolen. It can die. It can grow. It can make one family richer than another. With crops and herds, inequality began to deepen. Some households stored more. Some controlled better land. Some had more animals. Some had more labor. A village may begin as a community, but storage quietly creates comparison. Who has enough? Who has extra? Who owes? Who commands? This is one of the great ironies of settled life. It did not necessarily make life easier. Early farmers often worked harder than hunter-gatherers. Their diets could become narrower, based heavily on grains. Living close together with animals increased disease. Permanent settlements collected waste, attracted pests, and spread infection. Crop failure could be catastrophic because people depended so heavily on a few foods. And yet farming populations expanded. Why? Because agriculture can produce more calories per area of land than foraging. It can support more people, even if individual lives are harder. In the long run, the settled village could multiply. More food led to more people. More people demanded more food. The cycle tightened. No one chose the whole system at once. A family might plant because wild grain was scarce that year.
A village might stay because stored food was too heavy to move. A group might defend a field because they had already invested labor in it. Parents might have more children because children could help weed, herd, fetch water, grind grain, and guard animals. Each small decision made sense. Together, they built a world no one planned. As villages grew, new problems appeared. A nomadic band can often manage conflict through kinship, reputation, and movement. But a permanent settlement concentrates people in one place. Disputes over land, water, marriage, inheritance, stored food, animals, and labor become harder to escape. Someone has to decide where one field ends and another begins. Someone must organize irrigation ditches, harvest timing, defense walls, storage spaces, and rituals. At first, authority may have been informal: elders, skilled hunters, ritual specialists, respected families. But as villages became towns, leadership hardened. The stored grain did not only feed people, it fed power. In the earliest large settlements, we begin to see the shadows of institutions: communal buildings, shared storage, ritual spaces, special objects, long-distance trade, labor organized beyond the household. These are not yet empires, but they are the roots of empires. When people settle, they create surplus. Surplus allows specialists, potters, weavers, builders, priests, traders, guards, administrators. Specialists create complexity. Complexity requires memory. Memory becomes marks. Marks become writing. Writing begins, in part, because settled societies need to count grain, sheep, labor, land, offerings, debts, taxes. The first cities were not born from comfort. They were born from accounting, obligation, ritual, and control. In Mesopotamia, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates helped make this transformation immense. Their floodplains could be fertile, but they were also unpredictable. Water had to be managed. Canals had to be dug. Fields had to be coordinated. Grain had to be stored. Temples rose as centers of both worship and administration. The gods were not separate from the economy. Their houses received offerings, held land, organized workers, and redistributed food. In this world, staying in one place eventually meant belonging to a system larger than the family. The village became a city. The city became a state. The state learned to demand. But the first settled people did not know this future. They did not know that a field of grain would one day lead to tax collectors. They did not know that storage pits would become temple warehouses. They did not know that village leaders would become kings. They did not know that counting tokens would become writing, or that writing would preserve laws, debts, myths, royal victories, and the names of rulers who claimed the gods had chosen them. They only knew the immediate world: a good harvest, a hungry child, a dangerous winter, a field worth protecting, a grave they did not want to leave behind. This is why the question, why did humans stop being nomads, has no single answer. They stopped because the climate changed. They stopped because certain plants and animals made settlement possible. They stopped because grain could be stored. They stopped because population grew. They stopped because staying created advantages and then created dependencies. They stopped because the land began demanding labor in exchange for food. They stopped because leaving became costly. They stopped because their dead, their houses, their fields, their animals, and their stored harvests tied them to one place. They stopped gradually, unevenly, sometimes willingly, sometimes under pressure, sometimes without realizing they had stopped at all. And perhaps the deepest answer is this: humans did not abandon nomadism because they found an easier life. They abandoned it because they found a different kind of security, a dangerous security, a security made of walls, seeds, storage, memory, and obligation. The nomad survives by knowing when to move. The villager survives by making movement unnecessary. But once movement becomes unnecessary, it can also become impossible. The first villages were not small versions of modern towns. They were fragile experiments at the edge of survival. Every harvest was a gamble. Every season tested whether staying had been wise. A drought could turn the promise of settlement into a trap. A disease could spread through crowded houses. A raid could empty a grain store in one night. Yet the experiment spread, because when it worked, it changed the scale of human life. A landscape that once supported a few wandering bands could support hundreds, then thousands. Children grew up knowing one place is home. Paths became roads. Camps became villages. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. And cities began asking questions no nomadic band had ever needed to answer. Who owns this land? Who controls the water? Who counts the grain? Who speaks for the gods? Who gives orders when strangers attack? Who pays? Who obeys? From those questions, civilization emerged, not as a sudden triumph, but as a bargain. Humans traded freedom of movement for food security. They traded flexible lives for larger communities. They traded wild variety for cultivated abundance. They traded independence for protection, ritual, hierarchy, and law. The bargain was powerful, and it was costly. We still live inside it. Every city today carries the memory of that first decision to stay. Every border, every deed, every tax record, every warehouse, every temple, every bank, every government office, every calendar of work and harvest has roots in those early settlements where humans began to bind themselves to land. The world we know was not born when humans learned to walk. It was born when humans decided, slowly and uncertainly, to stop walking. And somewhere in that long turning point, a family looked at a patch of earth and saw more than food. They saw next year. They saw their children. They saw their dead nearby. They saw grain waiting in storage. They saw animals behind a fence. They saw smoke rising from the same hearth morning after morning. They saw danger, but also memory. They saw labor, but also belonging. For the first time, the future had an address. That was the beginning of the settled world, not the end of human struggle, not the beginning of comfort, but the moment the human story changed direction. Before kings, before cities, before writing, before empires, there was this quiet revolution. People stopped following the world and began trying to make the world stay still around them.